The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host.
Hello, I am Richard Christel. I am a program officer here at the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at the Center for International Private Enterprise. Joining me today is the National Democratic Institute's Anti-Corruption Advisor, Corina Rebegea. Today, we'll discuss her literature review titled The Role of Anti-Corruption Communications in Sustaining Integrity Reforms. So this podcast itself is a part of the ACGC's Rapid Response to Anti-Corruption Initiative, where, of course, effective messaging is key during windows of opportunity for anti-corruption reform. As part of this effort, the ACGC is beginning a new initiative to work with researchers Nick Cheeseman at the University of Birmingham and Karen Pfeiffer at the University of Bristol, UK, to develop a toolkit on what makes effective anti-corruption messaging campaigns. As part of this effort, we will also be working with partners in Nepal and Sudan to pilot some of these new tools. So with that, Corina, thanks so much for joining today. We're really excited to learn more about your research. So first, could you get into the genesis of this project? What made you want to do this research? What were you searching to learn?
Hi, Richard. First of all, really great to be on the podcast. Thanks for having me. And it's a very exciting topic, so I'm glad we have the opportunity to discuss. Well, the project started at some point in early 2021. And as you may recall, there were some interesting developments in countries around the world in 2020. And this concept of window of opportunity became really interesting for the international research community and the donor community and CSOs and so on. So there's been a lot of discussion about, what happens when there's a regime change or a regime opening, a democratic opening, and how we can best support those reformers that find themselves in the situation of sort of rebuilding at least some aspects of the governance system. And in particular, I would quote also two countries that have undergone this process quite extensively, where the regime change was very motivated by this anti-corruption agenda. And these two countries are Zambia and Moldova. So we were inspired both by the intellectual discussion that was happening and also these examples of countries that were making the transition from highly corrupt regimes to new political leadership that was running on an anti-corruption platform and promising to institute integrity reforms. So within that, one important element that we thought was maybe under-discussed was this issue of how we talk about anti-corruption and the importance that the discourse or the narrative about corruption plays in actually supporting the anti-corruption reform, right? And so there are several implications, also because looking at other transitions in the past, there's this high enthusiasm at the beginning. And then I think the way we communicate about the reform process and the institutional changes has an impact on how people see the success of this reform and how long their patience extends, so to speak. So managing expectations, making sure that we get the buy-in and the support and really the collaboration in a more sort of participatory sense from citizens is really crucial, especially in these moments. I think that's where the tension is because there's limited time, limited attention from the reformers, and yet this is something that we really need to focus on. So then let's look at this issue. How can we support reformists in window of opportunity contexts, can act quickly and make sure they use the right communication tools to get that public engagement, to get that support for their policy, to inform their policy and make sure that they manage expectations and also fend off sort of the opposing factors, which are obviously many in contexts like that.
Great. Yeah. So what would some of those lessons, I guess, for promising anti-corruption campaigns be?
Absolutely. Happy to get into that. I will say, and we'll maybe have an opportunity to talk about this, there are a lot of lessons on what not to do from both the academic research and sort of more of the practitioner side, where we've seen project being implemented and looking at the different ways in which you can use communication and anti-corruption campaigns to support the reform agenda. And I would also make one note that research on anti-corruption campaigns in a window of opportunity context is very, very limited. The lessons that I'm discussing are based on the existing research, the what not to do, but also some of the positive lessons, and also combined with what we know about the constraints of a window of opportunity. So this will come as no surprise, but the first lesson is know your audience. And that means we really need to take demographic information into account, and not just demographic information, but also sort of contextual information, information about the prevailing norms and sort of the institutional legacies, the corruption legacies, and so on, and really understand what might be the individual cost-benefit calculations that citizens and other actors will be making when we sort of target them with a campaign. So we think it's really important to sort of ground this research and make it evidence-based is to collect good data. And this could be done through sort of opinion research, quantitative methods, but also qualitative methods, organized town halls, all types of engagement that can help you gather the information that you need about your stakeholders. Again, not incredibly new, but I think really crucial in window of opportunity. I think one important lesson, if we look at the existing research and project, is that, we need to think about crafting campaigns in a way that doesn't reinforce the perception that corruption is pervasive and that corruption is intractable. That's one of the major pitfalls that existing research identifies when it comes to anti-corruption campaigns, is that they tend to create corruption fatigue and reinforce this negative perception that people have that corruption is just so widespread that it makes it impossible to fight. And even here, there are some important insights from the research in how we craft those campaigns, maybe focusing not on the negative, but rather on the positive developments, what we've done, what solutions have worked, what institutions have worked, or what they're doing, accentuating or reframing the way people think about the prevailing norm in society. So instead of reinforcing this perception that everybody's corrupt and everybody's engaging in corruption, changing that perception and making people understand that others are like them and they reject corruption and they would much rather not engage in corruption. So that's also a promising avenue.
So yeah, in the research though, you talk about how in Mexico, there was this work done on descriptive norms, like corruption is bad. And I think, as you're saying, to focus instead on injunctive norms. So I think you've already explained a little bit. Can you go a little bit deeper? What are descriptive norms and what are injunctive norms? And I guess in these campaigns, in your research about these campaigns, was there like a shining example of what was a good injunctive norm and what was just a descriptive norm that, as you put in the report, just backfired?
Yeah, so this study that you mentioned that happened in Mexico is actually the only one that uses the concept of descriptive versus injunctive norms in the area of anti-corruption. So this has been used in other sectors during the pandemic in the health sector, looking at how people respond to public health measures. But I wanted to mention this because it is seen as one potential avenue for structuring anti-corruption campaigns in a way that avoids those pitfalls that we were talking about, that entrenched sentiment that corruption cannot be fought. And the idea is, in highly corrupt countries, the prevailing norm, which is also the descriptive norm, is that everybody's corrupt, everybody's engaging in corruption. However, as the study in Mexico showed, when you ask people, they reject corruption. This conflicts with their sort of moral or ethical standards, but they don't know that others have similar moral standards. And so the injunctive norm comes in. The injunctive norm is really that moral piece, that we reject corruption, we refuse to engage in corruption, and we think this is reprobable. And so when you shift that understanding and you help, through a campaign, you help people see others as sort of like-minded individuals, and helping them understand that the others also reject corruption, that the others have the same moral standards as you, then this helps with sort of eliminating that negative feeling that nothing can be done.
So essentially changing a citizen's perception of I'm not corrupt, everyone else is corrupt,
right,
to I'm not corrupt, and there's other people who also are corrupt.
brand corrupt. So, something can be done about it. This increases interpersonal trust, and it opens avenues for a different type of sort of addressing the issue of corruption. So, I think that's interesting. And I think in terms of communications, it's a way to think about how we might frame the campaigns and the messaging that we're putting out there, or, we're advising civil society or governments to put out there. So, one of the note I'm making is that we need a lot more research and a lot more experimentation to see really what works and sort of test out a few messages and campaigns in order to be able to tell what works and in what ways. And we need to do this in contexts where we have this window of opportunity, so we can also test against the other factors that are at play. As I mentioned, rapidly changing environments, maybe there's a conflict looming, an institutional change, maybe a constitutional change, disinformation. There are all these factors that come into play. Also the historical legacies. I think that makes them a little different. So using that type of framing in this type of context, I think will help us learn a lot more about what works in anti-corruption campaigns.
Well, just on one of those examples you mentioned of like a window of opportunity. So you also mentioned in your research about work you did in Moldova.
Yeah. So
can you describe that work and what you learned?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this builds on one of the lessons we learned by conducting this research, and that's know your audience and make sure you understand where citizens are in terms of their understanding of corruption and priorities on anti-corruption. So we've done qualitative research actually in 2 countries, in Zambia and in Moldova, and we're currently doing similar research in Honduras. But I used the Moldova example because I thought it was really interesting and very sort of substantive in terms of findings. So because in Moldova, the new government had come to power and the new president on an anti-corruption platform. And of course, the country...
And the new president of Maya Sandu.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
The new president, Maya Sandu, and then subsequently her government, like half a year later. And they had this huge challenge to fight the remnants of an oligarchic system and these huge corruption scandals, such as the thefts of the $1 billion from those 3 Moldovan banks and the laundromat and a lot of other issues. So really big, high-level grand corruption issues. So that was an interesting element to test and see how Moldovan people see this agenda, how they understand the priorities and sort of the government's ability and commitment to pursue them and to fight corruption, and also their experience and their understanding of corruption. And I have to admit, my own, well, not bias, but my own understanding going into this research was that there will be a lot of alignment between what the government is trying to do and what the people of Moldova want to see done in terms of fighting grand corruption, just because this has been the main issue on the agenda for many years. And it's been in the media and everybody talks about it. So you think this type of priming would lead people to focus on this issue. And one of the interesting findings when we did the focus groups was that while this was an important item that Moldovan citizens recognized, the more important thing for them was the way they were experiencing corruption in day-to-day interactions with police and hospitals, within schools, public administration. So a lot of their understanding of corruption and what can be done to fight corruption was shaped by these daily interactions more so than this grand corruption agenda that the government is pursuing. So that was one interesting factor, which I think raises...
So, essentially you're saying the focus groups, you went into this with the idea that the citizens will care more about grand corruption because that's what the government has been trying to tackle. But you're saying really they cared more about just their personal interactions with corruption on a day-to-day basis. The idea of grand corruption, it's out there, it's nebulous, it's hard to tackle. But if I were a citizen, what matters most to me is being able to get healthcare without paying a bribe or get police service without paying a bribe. Is that right?
Yeah, I would add a little bit of nuance. Sort of the economic impact of grand corruption is tremendous in Moldova, right? $1 billion, I think that was the equivalent of 16% of the GDP at the time. So that was tremendous. And so, sorry, not of the GDP, it was the budget for the public sector budget. And the impact is really tremendous. And people do recognize this as a problem. And I thought that in the responses in the focus groups, this will be flagged more. Actually, what was flagged more was people's frustration with the fact that they had to pay for services that they were entitled to, and that there was almost like an inescapable situation where you have to do this. So this question of alignment between agenda is really just prime territory for an anti-corruption campaign, it tells me. We're going to look into more detail in how people think about corruption in Moldova and the solutions and the priorities in a follow-up survey soon. But the focus groups were really interesting. So that was one key factor, or one key finding that really, I think, raised a lot of good ideas and pointers that we discussed also with policymakers afterwards in Moldova. There were a few others. For instance, people had some ideas about what should be done to fight corruption. And that was interesting because it shows, quite a sophisticated understanding of the different facets of corruption and the different ways to tackle it. From, they talked a lot about enforcement, for instance. So people want to see justice being done, which I think is one area where that aligns with the government's agenda, right? Just going after corrupt people and making sure they return the damage that they compensate for the damage that they brought to the Moldovan society and state. It included some other ideas, for instance, increasing salaries and in the public sector. I mean, we know from the literature to what extent that actually works, but it was just really interesting to see how people think about some of the solutions. And
so if you can, what were some of those solutions? What was the solution pitched by one of those focus group discussions?
Well, one of them was to increase salaries in the public sector, thinking that officials or public servants will not be forced to ask for a bribe if they are compensated fairly. And again, we know that this is not the key way in which you address corruption in the public sector, but I thought it was interesting that they could see the structural issue, right? But that this is a structural issue. They could see that it's forced, it's a normative sort of constraint on both sides of a corruption relationship, so to speak. And some of the other solutions, things that I think reflected the public discourse on this, to strengthen the anti-corruption prosecution and the anti-corruption bodies, to make sure that the prosecutions are followed up by court sentences, cleaning the justice system, making sure that there's communication on corruption. Again, that was really interesting. People felt like there needs to be more in the public conversation, more of a discussion about corruption. And then that's interesting.
Yeah, yes. with the earlier discussion on descriptive norms, corruption is bad, but you're saying that having proactive communication from the government of their progress and of, I guess, prosecutions or cleaning up anti-corruption, that's good. But instead of just saying corruption's bad, it's more corruption is bad and we've made this progress.
Right. And then people said, we need more education campaigns on corruption. This was a vague education campaigns, but it was kind of a public demand. Again, these are focus groups. It's not generalizable data, but I think they offer good insights. And then I would maybe flag one more example that they offered is for people to be more engaged in fighting corruption. So something kind of placing the responsibility on citizens and civic groups, not just the government. So I thought that was also an interesting recognition of the role that citizens play. We have to be aware of all the constraints, the structural constraints and systemic constraints that, of course, we talked about and people are aware of. So these were some of the proposals that citizens had. And I would maybe add another finding that was that I think would be consistent in other contexts as well, is that sometimes there's a blurred line between what constitutes corruption and what constitutes a gift or, one of these showing appreciation for a service. And I think, again, this is sort of prime territory for for a communication campaign to clarify where those boundaries are. What is corruption? What services, what public services you are entitled to, so that you don't have to pay a bribe, and whatever you pay, it shouldn't condition the receiving of that service or public good.
It sounds like it would fit with that education campaign that the citizens were wanting, though.
Yeah, exactly. See, we're already designing campaigns just by looking at that. And sorry, just one more thing, because when we looked at the results of the focus groups, we sort of compared them with what we were learning from the Lit Review and the international sort of research and practice. And one of the lessons learned, I guess I didn't get to that, is that you need to make in your communication campaigns, you need to make the issues as specific and tied to people's experiences and context as possible. Local issues, things they care about. And I think that came through in the focus groups when people started talking about what they were facing in their daily experiences and interactions and jobs. And these were the things that mattered to them. And this is where perhaps the effectiveness of a campaign could show more promise, or where campaigns could be more effective. I thought that was an interesting parallel to make with what we learned from the research, from the Lit Review.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just as a result of your focus group discussions and everything you learned and mentioned here, if you could go back in time to when Sandhu was first elected, and if you were her own anti-corruption advisor, what advice would you give her during that moment? And as a result of these focus groups, would you change your advice?
So that's interesting. I mean, I already admitted my bias, right? So without having done this research and the focus groups, I think my advice perhaps wouldn't have been the correct one. I would have advised to pursue the grand corruption and the big cases, which she is, and the Moldovan authorities are. Again, just because of the impact that it had on Moldovan state and just the way it shaped the relationship between the citizens and the state. And I think that trickles down to the levels that citizens care about. But after the focus groups, I think really looking into how to communicate to citizens about this agenda, why it's relevant, how it impacts their lives more directly. I think in the focus groups, we've seen people have a really good grasp of how corruption impacts the prospects of future development and just having a good life in Moldova. So I think building a little bit on that and making sure that this agenda also resonates with the public, and that we get the public to also have an input in what we pursue. But I think this is probably how my advising would change from before the focus groups and after the focus groups. Paying more attention and putting your ear to the ground and paying more attention to where people are and how things are going to land with them, just to ensure that they're still committed, that they're still supportive of what the government is doing, and that they still sort of give credit and are hopeful that the government is on the right path and that they're pursuing the right things and that they're making progress. So I think that's important, bridging that gap and creating that alignment.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense to me, and I appreciate that you acknowledged you would change your answer. I mean, I just find that very interesting, the whole focus group discussion in the literature review itself. And one last question: you've talked a lot about areas for prime for future research. As a result of this research that you've done here, can you speak a bit more on some unanswered questions you had walking away from this research? And if you could, what are, I guess, 3 areas you're really suggesting that the field should do more research into?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the big question is, how do you take all this knowledge and apply it in an environment that's rapidly changing, right? The window of opportunity or the bright spot, or however we want to call it. Because again, there are different constraints than in just normal circumstances. So is there a way that we can prepare and learn so that we can help reformers be swift and use these tools effectively? And what kind of communication tools would they be using? So I think that's the big question. I think another question is on, especially when we talk about reform opportunities or window of opportunities context, what is the the purpose, what is the goal of anti-corruption campaigns? I think clearly defining the goal and working with reformers to understand what that goal is, I think is really crucial. I mean, in the research we've seen so far, I think the focus is a lot on maybe behavior change. Don't pay a bribe, right? Or maybe attitudinal change. Corruption is bad, or corruption kills. Again, this is one major criticism. These are so vague. We don't really know how they're going to land and what's the expected result. So I think one big question is, how do we test campaigns that have more specific goals and that are not necessarily focused on behavior change? Are there other types of campaigns? Is it to consolidate a policy or to gain support for a policy? What are some of those goals that reformers have that we can support? So one area of research is that. Another important area, I would say, is the intersection between anti-corruption reforms and disinformation. And this is where we will be doing some work as well. I mean, disinformation is an ubiquitous problem, but I think corruption has been a predilect area for disinformation campaigns and disinformation narratives. And this can be from sort of foreign malign actors, but also from domestic actors that are maybe targeted by corruption investigations. And they can do a lot of harm and really barrage all of the efforts that a reformist government is trying to put in place. So understanding that interplay and understanding the barriers that disinformation poses to anti-corruption campaigns, and maybe how we can tailor or use anti-corruption campaigns to achieve both sort of pushing back against disinformation, but also achieving the goal that they intend to achieve, whatever that is, depending on who's structuring this. I think these are big questions. And one final big question is the role of gender. I mean, we talk about, knowing your audience and understanding where people are coming from and their different experiences and how this shapes their understanding of corruption. And gender could play a big role in this. There isn't really anything on gender and anti-corruption. There was one incomplete study that I looked at that had this sort of personas that they were trying to investigate, and one of them kind of had a gender component. But that's about it. And we've seen it in focus groups that answers differ. And of course, we know from the literature that men, women, other groups experience corruption differently. So I think looking into that also for researchers opens really interesting avenues.
Yeah, I mean, all that is fascinating to me. I mean, just in the research you're talking about how women talk more about corruption, education, and health, while men talked about it more with their interactions with the police. I don't know, it makes me wonder if we know that, I guess, not bland anti-corruption campaigns, but generic anti-corruption messaging campaigns where we consistently talk about corruption's bad, don't do it. And we're finding in all this research that that's not super effective and there's better ways to go about it. I would say, or I would ask, why do you think we still stick with these bland or generic one-size-fits-all anti-corruption messaging campaigns when it just over the years we're finding that just doesn't work?
That's a good question. It's easier. Maybe that's it. I mean, these campaigns are everywhere. They've been around for a long time. You see all these posters. Again, don't pay a bribe. Especially in high corruption contexts, don't pay a bribe is not even an option, right? That's why you need to understand where people are coming from. You can't tell them not to pay a bribe when you're not addressing the systemic issue that they're facing every day. So it could be that it's easy. It could be that we haven't yet developed the campaigns or the models, the typologies that work so that we can come with the alternative. I think there's a lot of research happening now, and it's great. I mean, you guys are doing it, we're doing it, so academics are doing it. So we'll see maybe a lot more on how to help governments and civil society groups structure those campaigns in ways that are not ineffective and they just shoot in the air, in the sky.
Yeah. Well, listeners, I would say if there's one thing you learned from this podcast today, I would hope it's make more tailored anti-corruption messaging campaigns, no more bland, generic corruption is bad. Also, please read Corina's fantastic research. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. Corina, thank you so much for joining, and it was great speaking with you.
Thank you. Likewise. Anytime.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit cipe.org.